Humans have been obsessed with robots since the dawn of time. But what if I were to tell you that you could pilot a robot without ever leaving your kitchen table? Impossible, you say? Hardly. Welcome to Quinns Quest. If you were to tell the TTRPG community that you wanted a mech game, there's one name that's going to come up: Lancer. And there's lots of reasons for that, but let's start with the best one. It has the best, most lovingly crafted, personality-sodden mechs in the business. Put me in, coach, your players will say, referring not to a field of play, but a cockpit, and not a sport, but a war. Have I played Lancer? A foolish question. As the Quinns Quest guarantee, my friends and I played this for 9 sessions, and while we all had fun and I want to talk about the triumphs of this book, I also want to talk about where this big lumbering beast stumbles a bit. So Lancer is actually inspired by the design of Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. The version of D&D that said, hey, if this is a combat game, which D&D is, let's make the most of that. Let's make it a game where you have to play on a grid. To play Lancer at my table, I bought some BattleTech battle maps and represented troops and status effects and whatnot by using some generic tokens, which worked fine. But Lancer is actually designed first and foremost to be played on a computer using internet, to play with people all over the world, wherever they may be. Will this catch on? I don't think so. So the rules for how you do stuff in Lancer that isn't fighting are about 6 pages long, while the rules on how to fight, both inside and outside your mech, are about 80 pages. And then the book's compendium of mechs, equipment, and enemy stat blocks are about 200 pages, while the rules for mapping your player characters' relationships and emotional development are non-existent. So that should give you an idea of this book's priorities. But who cares about feelings when you got mechs like this, motherfucker? And where each mech has their own manufacturer notes and core special abilities and unlockable subsystems, and where you've got sheafs of cool pilot techniques, and where the GM gets a veritable crate of enemy archetypes so they can make sweet and sour combat encounters quickly and simply. Unless I could interest Sir or Madam in designing a cool boss monster, which gave this GM all the delight of an untroubled youth visiting the Build-A-Bear workshop. Speaking of being equipped for the task at hand, Lancer has a cool, free computer program for players to manage their equipment and for GMs to manage encounters. But Quinns, to show us that, won't you need a computer? Right you are. One second. Yeah, here we go. Don't get excited. It might not be this fast if you have a computer at home. This is Lancer's CompCon, which contains all the fiddly stuff the game needs, with some cute presentation to let you feel a bit like a mech pilot yourself. But this immediately gave me problems. Not because I didn't understand it. I'm actually a bit of a computer whiz. But because the moment you want to house rule anything, a digital assistant turns from a helpful butler into a hateful butler, one who cares more about protocol than whatever it is you want to do. So because I wanted to tweak player progression in Lancer, I couldn't actually use CompCon, which is a shame. You know what else you can do on computer? Surf the web. And where better to surf toward than the official Quinns Quest fan club over on Patreon. If you enjoy these reviews we release publicly, you won't believe the ones we release privately, all about the art of roleplay. And there's more. Full unedited interviews with designers and access to my private diary. All for just $3.99 a month. That's the price of just 4 cups of coffee. And waiting for you on the Patreon right now to coincide with the Lancer review is a new video talking about a rather controversial opinion. It's about GMs throwing caution to the wind and letting players add to scenes, world build, and create NPCs during an adventure, just like the GM does. Think I'm talking out of my bottom? Why don't you subscribe to the Patreon, see if you don't learn a thing or two. Hey, I'm trying to do a review over here. I'm sorry, I didn't know that you were doing
It's
that.
okay.
So Lancer capably sets out what it wants to achieve, which is lengthy, tactical, varied combat that feels in the wheelhouse of an evening of Dungeons & Dragons, but in terms of the rules of the game, and more importantly, in its evocative art and the weaponry players use, it feels like a game that is completely fresh and absolutely distinct. Which is no small thing. It is excruciatingly difficult to come up with something as immediately exciting as being a lightning-flinging wizard or some ever-skulking rogue, but Lancer pulls it off, mostly through these fantastically exciting robots for you to define your pilot against. I spoke to designer Tom Bloom about his thought process when creating this book's magnificent robots in a little section I like to call, What Were You Thinking?
Like, I'm a visual designer primarily, right? I'm a comic artist, so when I was designing the game, it was really important for me to like include that like hero character element for every single one of the mechs, right? Like, this is the mech that does this. And if it had to be a really cool fantasy, man, because I think in RPGs it's important that you have a cool and very strong fantasy. I think that's really important when you're making any kind of RPG element that a player is going to take control of, right? That they have to say like, this is the thing I want to do.
How I would describe it is, you know, when you're engaging with a piece of mech fiction, there is generally like one kind of mech. Lancer simply has all of them, and more, that you've never seen before. You want to be a concussive cannon cowboy? A special forces breeze block? A sniper with tiny hands? Isn't that counterintuitive? Do you want to be a ninja? Do you just like macross? Would you enjoy just scampering from cover to cover in an electric warfare mech that's barely 10 foot tall? This is what I'm saying. This game even has mechs for people who want to be like a tonally challenging gnome. What if you were a firefighter in reverse who started fires? Do you like earthbending? I'm sure some people out there are like waiting impatiently for me to talk about the actual tactical game you're playing with these mechs, but I'm prioritizing talking about the robots because the robots are what made me and everybody else who gets into Lancer willing to learn this complicated rule set. And like, I'm glad I learned these complicated rules, but like, can I just make a side point here? Lancer is, without a shadow of a doubt, the game I'm reviewing in Season 1 of Quinns Quest that hews the closest to Dungeons & Dragons, and it is such a vivid reminder of why people who play D&D are so unwilling to try other games, because these rich combat games are just so hard to learn compared to literally every other RPG on the market. So can I just make a public service announcement? If you have only played D&D, you have no idea how easy it can be to learn other games, except this one. So combat rules. Free from D&D's need to play like the previous version of D&D, it plays a bit like XCOM. You'll be taking shots from behind cover, throwing down barriers, covering massive distances in a single turn to slice and dice enemies in melee combat, while trying to find the time to reload and repair. However, as compared to first level D&D characters, players in Lancer have more tactical options, including hacking enemy computer systems or, my personal favorite, managing heat. So basically, players can gun their engines to get extra actions on a turn, if you're willing to let your mech run hotter and hotter. If you run too hot though, you'll have to vent heat potentially by exposing your reactor, like a boss in a video game exposing its weak spot. And if you fully max out your heat, it's awesome. You're gonna have to eject your pilot on the battlefield with enemies lobbing artillery at you, and you're gonna have to run away, get some distance before the power plant explodes. Heat is like this cool mini game of risk-reward that gets even funkier if the enemies you're fighting are packing weapons or software to increase your temperature further, and it gets extra funky if your pilot has some talents that do stuff like gaining extra attacks by venting heat from your scorching hot engine. So as you're fighting in Lancer, you're worried about how much damage you've taken and how much heat you've taken. But also, the hit point system in D&D is deeply uninteresting until you fully run out of hit points and get to make those exciting death saving throws, except the fun of death saving throws is kind of tempered by the fact that your character is probably lying face down on the floor of a cave. In Lancer, taking damage and heat is always fun because your reserves of each are way smaller. But then when you fully run out, you make like a mini death saving throw, and then it fills up again. And the next death saving throw you have to make is worse and worse. All of which is a bit technical, but what it boils down to is that players in Lancer can never look at a full health bar and go, I'm fine. Also, if death does happen to your player character, you do then have the option of braving Lancer's excellently troubling rules for respawning as a wonky clone. This whole table's awesome, but I will just point out number 3, By accident or malign intent, your cognitive profile has been loaded into someone else's body. It might be a clone of a notorious or famous individual with both enemies and allies who thought you were dead. Or you might run into the original person your clone was based on. What else to tell you? You know how combat in D&D can be exciting, but waiting for your turn can sometimes be interminably boring? That problem is still kind of in Lancer, but it's slightly better. Because the game gives you more tactical options, you've got more to mull over, and the game also has essentially a boredom release valve, which is you can always take a load of heat and go absolutely ham while your friends tell you not to. However, while the presentation of rules in Lancer is, I'll say, acceptable, I can't overstate there are just a lot of rules. My players in Lancer were all lifelong gamers, and they were still asking about some rule or another, even by our 7th, 8th, 9th session. Which isn't to say the rules aren't elegant, only that Lancer isn't trying to be accessible. It's trying to be nuanced enough for players to really get their teeth into it and look forward to refining their build in session after session, and there's a lot of it. You could fuss with different pilot powers and mech equipment and manufacturer benefits for an age. No, I do have a straight up criticism of Lancer though. So you know, when you're playing D&D, you know roughly what to expect from a goblin or an owlbear or a wizard. These are inescapable concepts that we have all absorbed across our whole lives, like so much background radiation. In Lancer, basically, you're fighting machines, and machines are opaque. Even if you just say you're fighting a tank, your players are going to be like, how dangerous is a tank compared to my robot? Does it have subsystems? Should I be hiding? Now, a player can spend a combat action scanning an enemy to get their full stat block. And like, not all of this is relevant, but it still feels like slapping a particularly dense page of the monster manual in front of your team. And that is just gonna slow combat way down. Combat that was already quite slow with all these tactical considerations, and now your players are cross-referencing their tactics with these new numbers. So my players, bless them, did not scan enemies, even though it was the right strategic move, because they felt, as I did, it would have added 20 minutes onto fights that were already pretty long. One of my players actually commented that Lancer felt like nothing more than a AAA strategy video game that was made claggy by the fact you're playing it multiplayer. One more noteworthy difference from D&D that your group might like the sound of or might not. So a big part of D&D is gold and items and treasure, and players are hoovering up gold and items and treasure and allocating gold and items and treasure. Lancer? Hell no, baby. We've all made fun of D&D murder hobos, right? Well, in Lancer, you are much closer to an actual knight of yore. You are a noble hero going where you're needed. You're not going through the still warm pockets of people weaker than you are. If you lose your robot, it's like a Formula One driver totaling their car. People aren't going to be happy with you, but they will find you another robot so you can get the job done. And this is where Lancer's progression come from, because of course it has unlocks, right? But the unlocks are basically driving licenses. You don't level up, you gain a new license level with a mech manufacturer of your choice. So basically you don't find a new robot-sized laser sword, you send like an email and then get the license to print as many of that 3D laser sword as you want.
Yeah, that was one of the first things we started with, because what I hate in any kind of game is like tracking money and shit.
Yeah, but then the first thing you did in the first source book is add money.
Yeah, for the sickos.
Yeah, for people like me who want to be using a spreadsheet and calculating pennies, yeah.
No, because it's not a game about scarcity. It's a game about popping in a big robot and beating the shit out of other big robots. And you got to enable that. You can't have anything get in the way of that.
And this is why I couldn't use Lancer's superb digital assistant. I had a simple story I wanted to tell that involved my players finding mechs part by part, and because I didn't want to give my players full access to the catalog of stuff they could get licenses for, I couldn't use CompCon. Which brings me to my next point, right? So Lancer isn't just designed with the assumption you are definitely going to be playing with all of the rules. It's also designed with the assumption you are definitely going to be using all of the lore. This is not a problem, it's just a design decision. I'm talking about maybe your mech can unlock an NHP. What's an NHP? That's a non-human person. It's basically Lancer's highly regulated AI equivalent. Maybe you want to spec hard into the mechs manufactured by Horus. Who are Horus? Horus is a galaxy-wide conspiracy group who only meet on the dark web and kind of crowdsource their mech designs. Super cool, right? But very tricky to detach from this game. All of this just means that Lancer is a game for people who want to run a campaign with no foreseeable end. And if that's you, terrific, awesome. You're gonna have such a good time. But for me, with my little 9-session campaign, it felt like taking a trip to another country and you've just gotten over the jet lag and you haven't really seen much and then you gotta go home again. However, if you're tempted to embark on the campaign of your life with Lancer, let me just flag one other problem. Remember last episode where I talked about how the Wild Sea was a case study for having the right kind of lore? Lancer's core book, not the supplements, but the core book, is a case study in how not to structure and present your game's lore. Like Dungeons & Dragons, it's a game world where you want to kill monsters and get magic items. Lucky for you, there's a bunch of monsters that it's totally fine to kill, and they're holding magic items. Go get them, champ! Blades in the Dark, it's a game about stealing stuff, and it's set in a city where you can't leave and you can't kill anyone, but there's loads of rich people who you definitely deserve to be stolen from. Lancer? Oh boy, did the Lancer core book not understand the assignment. What you want is the book to give you a world that justifies and enlivens 4 people in robots getting into fights. I don't care. Give me like a planet that's controlled by the mob, and the mob simply won't stop drowning space giraffes. Somebody has to save the endangered space giraffes. Suit up, Lancers. Whatever. Are you ready to see what this book gives you instead? 11,000 years of history that features no robots at all. A shockingly zoomed out description of a galactic empire called the Union that thinks not in terms of robots but whole star systems, and its entire organizational flowchart, including such riveting entities as the OIT, the Office of Interstellar Transportation, a subsidiary of the UBO-NUPMM. But don't worry, it's not all bureaucracy. The Union also conducts mass-scale fleet combat. Is the fleet combat done with robots? No. I'm gonna stop being a dick. This world is actually good. It's just presented ass backwards. It reads like the internal document of the publishers for if they need to check anything about their universe, not something to get you super G'd up and get your imagination going about what you might put in front of your players. You know, it's not just that this core book fails to make starting a campaign of Lancer easier, it actually makes it harder, because if you want to stick to the canon, there's so much canon to learn.
We didn't really write enough like conflict settings into the book. There's all these flashpoints and conflict areas, which we had, right? But we don't really present them in any like detail where it's like you could set a campaign there. Our setting expansions are basically like, you know, here's an area where your game might take place where there's definitely a lot more like conflict going on. Like Long Room was me being like, what's the weird pirate infested part of Lancer space, or like Trade Baronies is like, here's like knockoff Dune.
Yes, we do have a very happy ending here. Lancer's supplementary setting books and adventures succeed at everything the core books fail to do. I've read them, I like them, they're good. If you want to play Lancer, I would strongly recommend picking up any one of them. A setting book, if you want to make your own campaign, or just one of the adventures, run that, get started that way. And like, obviously it's not great for a core book to be slightly inadequate by itself, necessitating you buy other things, but listen, if Lancer was a game designed to be played for like 5 sessions, I would give it a harder time. But for a game that wants to give you years of entertainment and gives away for free all of its player-facing rules and that digital assistant, I will totally give the developers a pass. So there's my review of Lancer. Breathtaking killer robots, really nice if quite heavy combat rules, but a game that twins its hulking, if good, combat with a hulking, if good setting. And I gotta say, I love this game's core vision. The RPG community is bloated with countless, endless, continuing attempts to replace D&D with another fantasy game that, if you squint, looks like a version of D&D. And I think Lancer is a phenomenal achievement to replicate the structure of an evening of D&D in a sci-fi game that is so bold and fresh and stylistically innovative. Here's Tom Bloom paying it forward by suggesting a couple of other tabletop role-playing games.
Well, the first one, man, is I want to shout out Gubat Banwa, man. You know, Filipino dude trying to like write a like Filipino tactics RPG. Way up my alley, because I love like Shansha and Shaw Brothers kung fu movies and stuff. Like, I'm way into that. You're gonna do Blades in the Dark, right? Like, John Harper makes games that know exactly what they are and that have structures in them that make them run really smoothly, and I love that.
Now, I want to very strictly demarcate this as the end of the review, because I want to close us out by talking about something that I took away from my campaign of Lancer. So I don't think we're going to see many games on Quinns Quest that use this D&D structure where half of your evening is this super drawn out tactical combat. So we all think of D&D as a role-playing game because it started role-playing games, but that's not quite right. D&D emerged from the wargaming community, and to this day it wears that ancestry on its sleeve. Today especially, D&D is a game of two halves. Half of it is a game where you're in character playing roles, and then the other half is this like almost inconceivably broad and frequently deep combat board game. Like if you watch a show like Dimension 20 or Critical Role, or when you play Baldur's Gate 3, or when I ran Lancer, you get these combats that last for hours. And like, broadly, where I'm at in my life right now, my people, I'm here for the role-playing. If you've not tried many modern RPGs, let me tell you, they have really cracked doing action sequences that are dramatic and characterful and just as exciting, if not more exciting than D&D, but they don't take an hour. They take minutes, and nobody has to learn a rulebook, and at no point do you hit a rule query where someone has to open the rulebook to start the game again as if it just crashed. And I'm thinking here about, games like Wildsea or Blades in the Dark or plenty of other stuff that you'll see on Quinns Quest in the future, but also I'm thinking about stuff like the OSR community, which stands for Old School Revival, which is basically people who feel very inspired by earlier versions of Dungeons & Dragons when it was simpler. And they're producing great games like Mouse Ritter or Mothership that do actual dungeon delving and resource management, just like D&D, but combat is simply less of a focus, and fights, when they happen, last minutes and not hours. And when I was planning my campaign of Lancer and I was buying the battle maps and designing enemy encounters, I was so excited it was going to be just like my childhood. And it's not that these battles weren't just as fun as I hoped. It's just that they would take huge bites out of the hours we had to play and leave very little room for anything else. And this is all hyper subjective. Lots of people like board games, apparently. And if you want something that's like a little bit of role play and a lot of board game, perfect, great, you're going to have a good time. But for my group, the high points of my Lancer campaign were the relationships between the pilots and the politics of their community, not because it was particularly riveting, but because those were the moments where the story was hanging in the balance and we had no idea what would happen next. And those were times that my players could make decisions and feel those decisions have impacts that changed the future. My players fell in love with their Lancer pilots, and they're really keen to go back to that universe we made together. But if we do, I can't help but wonder if I wouldn't run it in something like Beam Saber, a game that simplifies combat and prioritizes the relationships pilots have with each other. But I got excited to buy hex maps, didn't I? I got excited to plan combat encounters and listen to my players discuss tactics for defeating the boss that I put in front of them. And that stuff's awesome. But these days, I'm starting to wonder if it isn't the least magical part of D&D. A bold opinion, but then I'm a bold man. You have to be to make it big in the world of human imagination. As we place this game into the archives, allow me to thank you for your company today. And I hope I'll see you next time as we take another dip into my febrile world. But until then, play safe. Unless you want to play dangerously.